The crowd stood in shocked silence as Gheorghe Dozsa, the leader of a bloody peasant revolt, was dragged to his place of execution. His deathbed loomed before him, a sadistic piece of apparatus that would test the limits of brutality. A procession of Dozsa's men followed in his wake. They were about to be forced to commit an act of savagery beyond their comprehension. In today's episode of the Infographic Show, we'll look at one of the most cruel deaths in history. This is the gruesome story of Gheorghe Dozsa and the Hot Iron Crown. Gheorghe Dozsa was born in 1470 in Transylvania, Romania, then part of the Kingdom of Hungary. Later in life, he'd become known as something of a soldier of fortune in a region fraught with rebellions during a time of political tyranny and unjustifiable high taxes on an angry peasantry. Violence came naturally to Dozsa. As a young man, he committed a robbery at a marketplace, killing a number of merchants. His acumen for violence had gained him a fierce reputation by the time he was hired to fight against the Ottoman forces, for which he was eventually knighted by the King of Hungary and bestowed with property and gold. Following a successful campaign against the Ottomans, Dozsa became a household name with the Hungarian nobility. He was asked to put an army of crusaders together to fight the Muslim Turks. Slowly but surely, Dozsa enlisted peasants, yeomen, students, and religious men. He taught them the meaning of discipline. He taught them how to fight. He taught them how to kill. But when the time came for the Crusades to begin, the nobles refused to supply Dozsa's men with food and clothing. The last straw for the growing gang of 40,000 peasants was the landlords calling them in for harvest. When they refused, the landlords turned their wrath on the peasants' wives and children, who were already living in a state of near starvation. Dozsa and the peasants soon turned against the landlords, burning down their houses, taking all the riches they could grab. This soon developed into a full-scale peasant rebellion. The bodies of thousands of dead nobles lay strewn across the countryside. Manor houses burned bright in the night skies. Blood stained the walls of the castles the peasants looted. It turned out the peasants were actually very good at killing, partly in thanks to the training led by Gheorghe. The noble class was having nightmares. These rebels didn't just kill you, they often impaled or crucified the nobles, wiping out their families at the same time. To stop the revolution in its tracks, mercenaries were brought in from Venice and Bohemia, but Hungary continued to burn as Dozsa and his men demanded a redistribution of the land from the nobles to the peasant class, their army moving closer and closer to the capital, Buda. Dozsa warned the threatenous lying nobility who stood against him, threatening to suspend and hang nobles on their own gates, destroy their property, tear down their houses, and kill their wives and children in the midst of the greatest possible torture. The nobles were already planning a torture for Dozsa that was so vile it would make impalement seem tame. But for now, his army expanded. He enlisted not just Hungarians, but Romanians, Serbs, Slovaks, and Germans. Word spread across Eastern Europe. Fear spread among the wealthy. The uprising had to be stopped. On July 15th, the peasants run as victors crashed to a bloody end at Timișoara, Romania. An army of 20,000 men hired by the nobles crushed the rebellion. At the time, one of Dozsa's bands, headed by his brother Gheorghe, was just 2 miles away from their target of Buda. The payback against the rebels would be extreme. A warning had been sent to the peasants of the empire. This is what you get when you try to mess with the established order. They had watched their fellow nobility being bludgeoned, impaled, beheaded, and burned to death. So the nobles set their minds to creating something so sadistic, the shock would reverberate all around Europe. The punishment had to have a symbolic element. Dozsa had pretensions of being a king, so his punishment should be fitting for a king. He wanted the land to be shared among the peasants, so his captors devised a punishment that would mockingly and brutally align with these wishes. Some of the people were still on his side. The rebels who hadn't been captured tried to regroup, but the nobles rounded up the masses of peasants and tortured around 70,000 of them in what became a reign of terror in Hungary. The revolution was well and truly over. The day of Dozsa's execution went something like this. The crowd jeered and screamed obscenities at a now naked Dozsa as he was led out by men clutching daggers and swords. An iron throne sat on a platform above smoldering embers. The heat was so intense the throne glowed red. At its side, an iron crown and scepter were also being heated on hot coals. "So, you want to be the king of the peasants," the nobility had told Dozsa during his torture. "Then we'll make you the king of the peasants." Dozsa remained silent as he was marched toward the throne. He'd already forgiven those who had testified against him. He understood that their statements had almost certainly been forced out of them, as their feet were burned and their bones were crushed. No words were necessary. He was about to become a martyr. John Zapolya, the man who led the defeat of the peasant army, lifted his arm in the air and the crowd quieted. The judges who delivered Dozsa's sentence looked on as behind Zapolya, 3 rebels were impaled on spikes, their blood dripping down the poles. Someone in the crowd screamed words of support for Dozsa, who was now seemingly in a deep contemplation. A soldier rushed in and grabbed the man by the arm, dragging him away. The popping embers of the fire filled the stunned silence. "Let the coronation begin," Zapolya cried. Pipes and violins started to play a mocking tune as men dragged Dozsa over to the heated throne. They pushed him into the seat, where his skin immediately began to burn. He writhed in pain and tried to get away, but the soldiers kept pushing him back down. But no matter how intense the pain became, he didn't speak, just as he'd promised. The crowd grew strangely silent and still as Dozsa stopped resisting, looking almost calm. But this was only due to the fact that the hot iron had finally destroyed his nerves, providing him with some small amount of relief. At this point, one of the executioners drove a spike into Dozsa's back. He now just moaned, unable to move or react, his mind completely broken. But the coronation was just beginning. One of Dozsa's tormentors then used a pair of tongs to carefully pick up the heated crown from the embers of the fire and place it on Dozsa's head. The burning hot scepter was then also retrieved from the coals and placed in his hands. At this point, Dozsa was delirious, his life fading away. But before he fell unconscious, he had yet another torture to bear. He was forced to watch as his brother Gheorghe was brought before him. Dozsa had been promised his admission of guilt would mean his brother was spared, but all he could do was watch as he was killed right in front of him. It was another betrayal and another humiliation. But the barbarity still wasn't over. It was time for the pièce de résistance. A procession of captured rebels was led to the throne at sword point. They had been promised if they did something truly horrible, they would be freed. Their punishment? To eat the cooked body of their leader. Some of the rebels refused to eat and were immediately cut down. The rest? Well, the gathered crowd could only gasp as they earned their freedom in the most gruesome way possible. But even this wasn't the end for the rebel king. The records show that pieces of Dozsa's body were then sent around Hungary for display, as a warning to all, peasants and educated men alike, that this is what happens when you threaten the feudal order. A message Dozsa learned in the most brutal way possible. Now you need to watch Most Brutal Punishments Handed Down by the Pope, or have a look at Most Brutal Torture Methods by Mexican Cartels.